Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Dr. Ed Peck. I'm the Vice President for University Mission and Identity, and I'm very happy to have you all here so that we can do some innovative thinking and exploration in the Catholic social thought tradition to learn a little bit more about women's leadership, how we can support it, empower it, and learn from it. So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Jennifer Reed-Bouley. She is a professor and program director of theology at the College of St. Mary's, a women's college sponsored by the Sisters of Mercy in Omaha, Nebraska. She has taught courses in Catholic social thought and environmental ethics since 2004. Her article, Challenging Racism and White Privilege in Undergraduate Theology Contexts, Teaching and Learning Strategies for Maximizing the Promise of Community Service Learning, won the College Theology Society's annual award for Best Article Published in Theology. What year was that? Okay, and recently, she has, with Dr. Bernard Prusak, our own Dr. Prusak, co-authored a book called Catholic Higher Education and Catholic Social Thought, which was recently published in 2023, which applies the lens of Catholic social thought to the operational decisions in Catholic colleges and universities like John Carroll, where we are actually studying this book with the faculty and staff as part of a book club. So thank you, Jennifer, for doing that and sharing that work with us. Jennifer earned her Bachelor of Arts from the University of Notre Dame and her Master's in Theology and PhD in Christian Ethics from Loyola University, Chicago. Fun fact, Jennifer and I were classmates in that program, and so it really is a pleasure for me to bring her to John Carroll for her first visit and invite her to share her thinking, her important thinking on women's leadership with us tonight. So without further ado, Jennifer Reed-Bouley.
Thank you so much. I'm honored and grateful to Ed Peck for the invitation to speak with you this evening, and to your entire community for your willingness to think together about what can be a challenging topic. Thanks to all of you for coming this evening. Tonight, I'm going to make a Catholic case for women's leadership and why it matters. I teach at a Catholic women's college with a mission to foster women's leadership, so I've been thinking about and witnessing this topic for many years. And most recently, as Ed mentioned, I've learned quite a bit from Bernard Prusak. Bernard, why don't you wave, your own professor at John Carroll, and we collaborated in co-editing the book you see here. The title of this talk references a specifically Catholic case for women's leadership, and that may seem surprising to you because women can't serve as priests, deacons, or bishops in the Catholic Church. Although the Catholic Church in practice is ambivalent about women's leadership and participation, I'm going to focus on some of the rich resources within the tradition that ground a commitment to women's leadership and flourishing. Given our theology, the Catholic Church should be at the forefront of promoting women's leadership. There's a gap, though, between the very liberating theology we profess and the way that we operate in practice. So what do I mean by leadership? If you're involved in leadership studies, you know there are many, many definitions. I'm impressed by the variety of leadership opportunities you have at John Carroll, and so I'm using a definition of leadership from your own website. Leadership is a process by which a person influences others to accomplish an objective and directs the organization in a way that makes it more cohesive and coherent. I want to add to this definition that being included is a prerequisite for the ability to lead. So at times in this presentation, I'll discuss inclusion in decision-making positions, recognizing that if a group is not included, they can't lead. And then when I refer to the term women here, I include people with diverse backgrounds and identities, including race, ethnicity, class, religion, age, sexual orientation, marriage status, parenthood status. These and other aspects of women's identities, as they intersect with gender identity, influence how women are perceived and treated and the possibilities for their leadership. Further, we all know that women's viewpoints are not uniform. Women hold a range of political, religious, and other commitments that inform their styles of leadership and the policies that they advocate. Therefore, in this presentation, I suggest a foundation for leadership that emerges from the Catholic tradition, knowing that particular commitments and contexts affect women's leadership. In other words, simply because a woman occupies a formal leadership position does not necessarily mean she leads in a way that uplifts all women or matches the theology I'm describing. When we look at business, society, church, and other institutions, we see that both men and women have the capacity both to uplift and degrade others. So I'm not claiming that women are better or more capable than men in leadership or anything else. I'm arguing a Catholic case for equity of opportunity for both women and men, and how this improves chances for flourishing for both, and how the Catholic Church would have a greater chance of living its mission if women enjoyed greater leadership opportunities. So here's an opening question for you. I invite you to consider a woman leader, someone you've known personally or someone you know about. Identify who this person is and what makes her a good or effective leader. Find a partner, so you might have to move a little bit, and take 30 seconds to share your thoughts. I'll let you know when the time is up, and then I'm going to ask some volunteers to share with us who they chose and why they chose her. Okay, so if you'll find someone you can share that with, that would be great. So let's come back together, and I'd like to invite anyone who's willing to share who they chose and why they chose her. I saw you all having an animated discussion. Could you share someone you chose? Great.
So we chose Dr. Reed-Bouley, who is a...
Oh, wait. Sorry. Should I bring them the microphone? Great. Or why don't you at least stand up so you can tell us?
Okay.
Great. Thank you.
So we chose Dr. Reed-Bouley, who is a professor in the business college here, and I'm in Alpha Kappa Psi, which is our co-ed professional business fraternity here, and she's our advisor. And she just is, I think, a great example of a woman leader. She's always working with us on how to grow our organization and how to just make it a better place for everyone. I would definitely kind of describe her as a servant leader. She doesn't talk down to us or, tell us oh, this is how things should be done. She kind of meets us where we're currently at and is always there to really help us in any way that she can. So she's one of the main people I always look up to, especially here at John Carroll.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great you have a woman leader right here in your midst. Thank you. What about you all in the front? Did any of you come up with a woman leader you could describe? Jane, thank you.
I brought up the Dean of Students at my school. She is a really empowering female presence, and we all go to the same high school, so she really touches everyone's lives and empowers us.
Thank you. Great. What about somebody else? Yeah, I'd like to hear a male perspective.
So I chose Beth Hammock. She's the CEO of the Cleveland Federal Reserve, so she's in control of all the finances, and then also has to report to the Fed of Washington, D.C., so she's got a big role in that.
Yeah, and what makes her a good leader in your view?
I would say just her dedication to the Federal Reserve. She's very determined, I'd say.
Thank you so much. Good. So I heard determination, empowerment, meeting people where they're at, and then working with them to develop their potential. Anybody else want to share a woman leader? Okay. Well, you've got some great examples here. So I'm going to make the Catholic case for women's leadership and why it matters, and I've organized the presentation in two parts. First, I'll address the foundations in Catholic theology, highlighting two central beliefs, and then Catholic social thought, highlighting three principles that are particularly relevant for demonstrating why women's leadership matters. And let's begin with Catholic theology. The Catholic theological case for women's leadership is expansive, and so I'm just going to focus on two parts tonight. The first is called the Catholic sacramental worldview. When we think about the sacraments, what we might think of first are the 7 official sacraments like baptism, Eucharist, and marriage. But a sacramental worldview includes these and also an entire worldview, that is, a Catholic view of how God relates to humanity. For Catholic theology, God's love or God's grace suffuses our everyday life so that any experience can reveal God's love. God's love is always with us even when we're not aware of it. For example, have you ever sat in a waiting room without your earbuds and then suddenly realized, oh, there's music playing and I know this song? It's been there the whole time, but then you suddenly wake up to it. Similarly, God's love is with us even when we're not aware. And those times that we do wake up to God's embrace are sacramental moments. This can happen many times throughout the day by looking at a tree or seeing a friend, or new parents with a baby that they're exhausted to wake up to in the middle of the night, and yet they look at that baby and they say, this is God disclosing God's love for me. And it doesn't have to be a particularly happy experience either. Maybe you've gone through a really difficult time and there's been someone who's texted you or sent you funny videos or been your ally, and that person reveals God's love for you. I have on this slide a quotation that I like from the theologian Michael Himes, and he says, anything, any person, place, event, any sight, sound, smell, taste, or touch that causes you to recognize the presence of grace, to accept it and celebrate it is a sacrament. So no dimension of human life lies beyond God's care and concern. The Catholic sacramental worldview insists that we can experience God's love and presence not only through prayer, mass, and other specifically religious activities, but also through the events and people in our ordinary lives. The sacred can be encountered in the secular. St. Ignatius of Loyola and the Ignatian tradition name this as finding God in all things. I'm sure you've heard that before. And they even have a process, the examen, for reflecting on our experience to see where God is revealed. So the upshot is that our actions to promote love, peace, and human flourishing in all of the dimensions of our lives can be expressions of our awareness of God's love. I've included some photos here of sacramental moments in my life recently. The Rose Garden, where my husband and I like to walk after dinner. My niece's 18th birthday party surrounded by my daughters and her other cousins. And the Stations of the Cross at a retreat I attended recently. And you can see these are not Instagram perfect pictures, right? This is real life. And that's what a sacramental worldview is saying, that to find God in the everyday and ordinary experiences of our lives. The second theological foundation I want to highlight is a social anthropology. This term refers to how we envision the relationship between God and humanity and among all of us as a human family. And so again, I'm going to ask for you to participate in an activity to illustrate this. I invite you to take a moment to find on your tag, on your shirt or your coat, the places where your clothes were made. And so you might have to help the person next to you. Let's try to find as many countries as we can of where our things were actually made. I'll give you a minute, and then I'm going to ask you to shout it out. Okay, so how many of you have something that was made in the US? Just raise your hand. Great. And keep those up. How many have something made in China? Raise your hand. Okay, great. So that's typically the two top places that we find in this exercise, but we know that our clothes were made all over the world. So could you just shout out, even without the microphone, some other countries that you found? Vietnam. How many had Vietnam? Okay, great. What are some others? Haiti. Anybody else have Haiti? Oh, go ahead. Bangladesh, great. Any other countries? Yes, thank you. Indonesia, great. Yes. El Salvador. Pakistan. Yes. Dominican Republic, great. And this gets even more complicated because that's just the final destination of your clothes before they got to you. Actually, if you have on something that's cotton, the cotton might have been grown someplace and then it might have been shipped somewhere else to be pieced together into clothing for you. And so I have this spider web here to illustrate how we're all connected in a web of relationships. And this exercise simply shows the economic relationships in which we're all connected. But we could make the same case, right, for our political connections, our spiritual connections, our physical health connections. Before COVID, I had a hard time explaining this concept to people, but as a result of COVID, we see, right, how our health is connected to people all over the world. So, the Catholic view that we're necessarily interconnected to all persons in a web of relationships acknowledges that we are individuals, we have free will, and we're responsible for our decisions and actions. But all of this is in the context of our relationships, as we're all connected in the body of Christ. So we're responsible for one another, not just our family and friends, but all of our brothers and sisters. So now that we've discussed two central theological foundations, I'm going to just put this back for a second. There we go. A sacramental worldview and a social understanding of the human person. Let's connect them to Catholic social thought, which has to do with the moral dimensions of social life. This is a really wide and complex field because social life is so complicated. So I'm only going to address parts of it that are most pertinent here around women's leadership. So what is Catholic social thought? It's both official teaching authored by popes and bishops. And how many of you have taken a class in Catholic social thought at John Carroll? Will you raise your hand if you have? Okay, so I'll just give some background. It's also the lived experience of faithful Catholics who influence society and the analysis of theologians and others like myself. Catholic social thought is accessible to all people of goodwill, so it's not exclusive to Catholics. And so while for Catholics it has deep resonance with the life of Jesus and the saints and the theological tradition, it's evident that those who are not Catholic or Christian can come to the same conclusions regarding the principles themselves, which, as Dr. Prusak has reminded me, are best understood as the requirements of justice. So in brief, Catholic social thought is based in part on the two theological foundations discussed earlier, the sacramental worldview and the social understanding of the human person. It speaks to the questions that you see here. How do we live by Christ's teachings and be responsible citizens, workers, and consumers? How do we realize the gospel's ethic of holiness in the midst of the messiness and complexity of history? In short, it's situated at the intersection of church and world, sacred and secular. We can approach Catholic social thought from many angles, and I can't address all those in our time together. So I've listed some of the oft-cited principles. Tonight we'll focus on three of these that are in bold: human dignity, common good, and option for the poor, that provide a strong grounding for women's leadership. And then I'm going to provide a short analysis of how women and men are faring in light of this. We begin with the principle of human dignity, meaning that as we're all made in the image and likeness of a good God, our worth and value are rooted in our identity as children of God. Our worth is not the result of our individual capabilities. So each and every person possesses the same human dignity regardless of race, religion, sexual and gender identity, and other characteristics. The dignity of each person cannot be taken away, even though it's often not recognized. It's intrinsic or inherent to the person by virtue of their humanity. The principle affirms that we don't all have the same abilities, but we do have the same worth that requires social protection. There's no hierarchy of value among persons. That's really different from the way we live, isn't it? Where we put people in hierarchies. For example, the person with Down syndrome who works in a grocery store and the Nobel Prize winning economist have the same dignity. Catholic social teaching stresses that a person's treatment and environment must be commensurate with or match their dignity. When we look at the church and society, we see that although women and men have equal intrinsic worth as children of God, church and society generally value men's leadership, labor, and other contributions more than women. I'm going to provide just a few indicators to show how this plays out in the workplace. In her book, Machiavelli for Women, Stacy Vanek-Smith offers some statistics that show how women's work is not valued as highly as men's work. And you can read all of these on the slide. And here's some information about some of the areas in which women are most underrepresented in senior leadership positions, positions that many students at John Carroll are preparing for. You can see here on the slide to what extent women participate in and lead each of these sectors. In all of them, the percentage of women in leadership declines at the executive level. And there's also really good evidence to show that those companies that do include women and people of color at the higher levels of leadership actually become more profitable. So it's not only the right thing to do, it also helps the bottom line. This brings us to the second principle of Catholic social thought I'd like to discuss, the common good. Common good is understood as the sum total of conditions needed to uplift every human life and to protect each person's dignity. This principle is grounded in the Catholic understanding of human beings as social that we saw in the clothing tag exercise. The common good affirms that we need communities and society to protect each individual's dignity. The individual can only be as healthy as the community in which she lives, and the community is only as strong as the relationships among the people who comprise it. While it's clear that women's lives are diminished when their intrinsic dignity as persons is not appreciated and promoted, it's also the case that many men are not flourishing in this current construct either. The principle of the common good helps us to see that when women's lives and leadership are valued less than men's, everyone suffers, as we are all interconnected. Here the example is public health. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy issued an 82-page advisory entitled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Social Isolation. Dr. Murthy defines loneliness as more than a temporary feeling. It's a persistent awareness that a person desires more social connections than they currently experience. According to the report, more than half of U.S. young people and half of U.S. adults experience significant loneliness, and that's why he calls it an epidemic. Persistent loneliness has significant physical and emotional consequences. It has the same physical effects as smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. A 29% increased risk of heart disease, a 32% increased risk of stroke, and a 50% increased risk of developing dementia for older adults. Loneliness and social isolation affect mental health, increasing depression and anxiety and making learning more difficult. Men in particular, it seems, are vulnerable to what are termed, quote, deaths of despair, including death by suicide due to loneliness and isolation. Men die because of overdose involving opioid and stimulant drugs at a rate 2 to 3 times greater than women. The gap in life expectancy between men and women is increasing in part because more men are dying due to drug overdoses, alcohol use, suicide, and gun violence. So while men may seem to be the winners in terms of income, wealth, and positions of authority and influence, Dr. Murthy's report shows that social structures are not serving men very well either. The solution, according to Dr. Murthy, is building stronger social bonds. He writes, quote, our relationships are a source of healing and well-being, hiding in plain sight. one that can help us live healthier, more fulfilled, and more productive lives. Given the significant health consequences of loneliness and isolation, we must prioritize building social connection the same way we've prioritized other critical public health issues, such as tobacco, obesity, and substance use disorders. Together, we can build a country that's healthier, more resilient, less lonely, and more connected, unquote. So an immediate implication for you tonight is that you're contributing to building the social bonds at John Carroll by being here, right? It might even be helping your physical and your mental health. If we interpret Dr. Murthy's recommendation in Catholic terms, he's referring to attending to the importance of the common good, building strong, resilient communities that uphold the dignity and well-being of every individual. So how do we move beyond a situation where we are all harmed by the ways in which we degrade human dignity and do not protect the common good? The principle of Catholic social thought called option for the poor is helpful here. This principle refers to a preference for acting with and for the poor and vulnerable, that is, anyone on the margins of society, those who are not enjoying the benefits of social good, and those who've been pushed out of the conversation. This is similar to the goal of Jesuit education expressed by Father Pedro Rupe as forming, quote, men and women for and with others. And I'm sure you've encountered that goal if you've been able to work with Dr. Catherine Feely and others at the Center for Service Learning and Social Action here. Option for the Poor insists that because God's love is here with us and because we're connected in a web of relationships, people who are socially excluded and marginalized have the greatest claim on our time, attention, and resources. Preference here means first commitment to those who are most in need. The term option can be confusing. It doesn't mean like an extra option or a choice, and it doesn't mean extra credit. It's really considered to be a foundation of the Catholic faith. It highlights that those of us who experience more inclusion have an obligation to view situations from the perspectives of those typically excluded. Now, how do we do that? It can only happen if we widen the circle of inclusion. How can this principle ground the case for women's leadership? Whereas in discussing human dignity and common good, I provided examples of how individuals and society are degraded by not following the principles. Here I want to provide a vision for how adhering to the option for the poor can strengthen institutions, in this case, the Catholic Church itself. As I mentioned at the beginning, we experience a substantial gap between the theology Catholics profess and the ways in which the Catholic Church operates. I want to highlight a step forward. Pope Francis's leadership gives reason for hope as he repeatedly invites dialogue with those whose concerns are typically ignored or invisible. You might know that Pope Francis led a 3-year worldwide process called the Synod on Synodality, which just concluded a few weeks ago in Rome. It started in 2021, and even some students at Catholic universities were invited to participate in listening sessions as part of a worldwide consultation process that took stock of the ideas and hopes of ordinary Catholics. In the past, synods have only involved bishops, but at this synod, lay men and women made up a quarter of the delegates. The synod meetings in Rome took into account summaries of themes that emerged from the local, national, and continental dialogues. The final document was produced by about 400 delegates from around the world. I want to highlight 2 aspects of the synod relevant to the option for the poor and inclusion of women. First, the very fact that Pope Francis and other church leaders designed a systematic process for a listening church is truly historic. Writing in the National Catholic Reporter, the Jesuit priest Thomas Rees observed, quote, "What is new here is a papally endorsed process that allows the laity to surface their views in a public way," unquote. As with any human process, it is flawed, but the fact that it occurred is a source of hope that synodality will not be a singular event, but a new way of being church. The synod's final document declares, quote, "The way to promote a synodal church is to foster greater participation of all the people of God in decision-making processes," unquote. Second, not surprisingly, synthesis reports compiled by conferences from every single continent cited concerns that women's roles and leadership be expanded in the Catholic Church. And let me repeat that. Catholics from literally every corner of the world who have wildly different cultures and norms all agreed that the role of women in the church is too limited. Quote, "Inequality between men and women is not part of God's design," unquote, declared the Synod. The widely expressed pain and suffering on the part of many women from every region and continent during the synodal process reveal how often we fail to live up to this vision. The fact that concern for women's perspectives and experiences is being documented by the Vatican as central to the life of the Church is significant. The final 2024 document disappointed many, including me, who advocate for a larger leadership role for women in the Church, particularly in restoration of the female diaconate and women's ordination to the priesthood. Please note that I said restoration of the female diaconate, as both the New Testament and early church documents include accounts of female deacons. These issues were not decided at the Synod, and they regarded them as ongoing topics for discernment. The hope is that the synodal process will not be merely an event, but a new way of being church. 2 U.S. cardinals have proposed that the U.S. Bishops' Conference would benefit from a committee on synodality that would increase accountability and ensure a more participatory and transparent process of decision-making in the Church. Inclusion of women and other typically excluded groups could make a positive difference for the Church, a difference that is sorely needed if the Church is to more fully live up to its mission. So what could all this mean for students at John Carroll University? You most certainly realize that the church and world you are being prepared to lead are marked by deep divisions and even contempt for some groups. Some men worry, without even realizing it, that if women occupy more powerful positions, life will get worse for them. At the same time, the Christian hope for the kingdom of God is that although it is not yet here in its fullness, we can work towards partial fulfillment of what our relationships and communities might become. A Catholic sacramental vision, going back to the beginning of the talk, encourages us to see how faith makes a difference in navigating the complexities of a fractured world. A social anthropology emphasizes that we are all connected. There are no others unworthy of connection and support. We're all part of the same family. Commitment to human dignity underscores the responsibility to ensure that society recognizes everyone's inherent value. Commitment to the common good implies a need to strengthen social structures and relationships so that they more effectively promote human flourishing for all people. An option for the poor implies amplifying the voices of those typically excluded so that everyone can benefit. Dr. Peck invited me to offer a prophetic message. And so here's my invitation to you as we work to rebuild a fractured society and church. Do not despair of the possibilities for unity, lifting one another up, and supporting those who are most vulnerable in order to create a more just, inclusive, and hope-filled future. When St. Ignatius of Loyola dispatched 3 Jesuits to the highly contentious Council of Trent in 1546, he highlighted 5 principles for them to practice, and they're just as applicable today. Quote, "Be slow to speak, listen attentively, seek the truth in what others are saying, correct misstatements humbly and gently, and allow the conversation the time it needs." So let us listen to one another and attend to each individual's unique concerns and situations. Let us build up the unity of the human family with particular attention to the concerns of those who have historically been excluded. The Catholic vision is that by doing so, we will contribute to building a more hope-filled future that further reveals the kingdom of God among us. And so now I welcome all of your questions and comments and observations. Thank you.
So who wants to ask the first question? Or make the first comment?
Definitely a student.
Okay, great. I was going to suggest maybe to just give you a time to just say one word that you're left with as a result of this talk. Just what's one word that pops into your mind? Talk about that maybe with one other person, and then maybe we'll warm up for questions. So I'll be asking you in a second, what's the one word that comes to mind for you? Okay, let's hear from some people we haven't heard from yet. Can we start in the back? What are some words that come to you?
I think he said as a group, unity.
Could you say that louder? Unity, thank you. What about you two? What's a word that occurs to you at the end of this?
Well, I said unity.
Okay, two shouts for unity. Thank you. What about you folks? What are some words that come to mind?
I think hope, and we talked about more than one word. I was saying that I'm not like a specifically religious person. I technically grew up Catholic, but sometimes like discussions of religion make me a little uncomfortable, and this was not uncomfortable at all, and I was like glad to hear about it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Great. What are some other words that occur to you? Change, great. Change in gender relations, is that what you're thinking of specifically? Okay.
Confidence.
Confidence, thank you. Great. What about you up here? Some words.
Empowerment.
Empowerment, good. And that really goes back to our beginning conversation, doesn't it, about the women that you chose as leaders. What other words?
Inclusion.
Inclusion, yes. There can't be a possibility for leadership without inclusion. Good.
Strength.
Strength.
Inclusivity.
Inclusivity, great. What about some of you here in the middle?
I have inclusion too.
Inclusion, great.
Hope over despair.
Oh, yes, thank you. That's important right now.
Mine is division. So, unity.
I was going to say complexity.
Justice.
Justice, thank you. What about you all?
My word like Ed was hope.
Hope.
I like your emphasis on community and interconnectedness.
Thank you. What about you all in the back? What are some words that come to mind? Diane.
Thought about you speaking of it's more than one word.
That's okay.
The Bible instructs us to be.
Thank you. So this isn't just something about new politics. This goes way back to the beginning.
I would say restoration and God's design.
Thank you. Great. Did you have a word? How? Great. How do we get there? Is that what you're asking? Yes. Yeah. That's challenging. Okay. So based on, we've heard a lot of inclusion, empowerment, division, the complexity of the situation. What are some questions that emerge from you? How is it definitely one? I wish that I had a clear, 5-step process here. Just here's a glimpse, I think, of how we do this, is somehow finding ways to really humbly, as St. Ignatius Loyola said, to humbly be quiet and listen to the perspectives of those who haven't been able to speak or whose voices have not been amplified sufficiently. And through that, get a new perspective, a new angle. As I was preparing this talk, I had a whole section on businesses that I decided I didn't have time for. So I'm glad your question is allowing me to talk about that. And that is the research on how, I mentioned it briefly, how companies that have a higher percentage of women and people of color in leadership positions actually become much more profitable. I see you smiling. Do you have something to add about this?
No, I'm just familiar with that
Yeah, and so in terms of how, I think that that's a really, for me, that's really a helpful bit of research, because I want to say from the Catholic theological tradition, this is the right thing to do, this is the faithful thing to do, this is the holy thing to do. But it's really nice to have some data from businesses that aren't necessarily informed by that tradition that show that actually institutions are stronger. And one of the reasons that it sounds like they're stronger is because people have more of a feeling of belonging, right? When we include a diverse group of people in making decisions. So thank you for your question. What other questions do you have or observations? Yes, in the back.
First, I just want to say thank you for being here and doing the presentation. At one point you said you don't have the same abilities, but we have the same worth and
Yes,
value.
yes.
Can you elaborate on how that applies to the workplace, especially when, CEOs and boards oftentimes overlook the humanity present in their employees?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I understand it, what you're saying is, according to the principle of human dignity, we all have the same worth, even though we have vastly different abilities. And what we see, though, in the workplace, we see it in the church, we see it in society, is that there's a hierarchy of value, right? And those who are at the top often aren't listening or including those who are considered to be less than. Yeah. It's a really interesting experiment that I might invite you to practice, and maybe you're already practicing it. Anyone who's at a university has a certain amount of inclusion, right? Though we may at times feel lonely, or we may experience persistent loneliness, there's inclusion in a ladder that typically has helped people to become higher socioeconomically. But really to do an experiment and really try to put yourself in places where you're with people who aren't often listened to and who don't have a whole lot of power. And there can be tremendous learning there. I was just having dinner with some faculty and some students and learning about a course at John Carroll where students are going into a women's prison, learning from the women and sharing. And that's, I think, a great example of recognizing the worth and the value in every human being, regardless of their status, incarcerated or not. So thanks for your question. Yes?
So you spoke this a little bit, but I wonder if you could say a bit more about perhaps about how specifically, what sort of resources are sort of available, do you think, specifically in the Ignatian tradition, as far as thinking about and promoting gender equality in leadership?
Yeah. So thank you. So what are the resources specifically within the Ignatian tradition for this? Because I've focused on the Catholic tradition with broad strokes and Catholic social teaching. I think Ed could probably address that better than I could in terms of your knowledge of the Ignatian tradition. It's interesting, that whole concept of being men and women for and with others from Father Arupe. As I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, those of you who are in Jesuit schools, it initially was men for others. Because it was intended for the male students at a high school. And the idea was for others, doing things for others. And that's really different from what we heard about leadership here, that leadership is about empowering others, right? Not just doing it for, but allowing people to express their capabilities and do it for themselves. So I think the evolution of that aphorism within the Jesuit tradition is an important one in terms of the understanding that, yes, this is men, women, this is all people, and that the idea is not only serving others, but it's advocacy and empowerment in order to create a more just society. That would be the one that I would point to, but I'm very interested in knowing if others of you who teach and work here have other ideas about the gems in the Ignatian tradition.
I'll start by, if we look at the life of Ignatius, he was accompanied by women throughout his whole spiritual journey. And what we see today, and they made a very significant impact on him, and they were dialogue partners with him and participants in the spiritual exercises. So he learned about giving the spiritual exercises in partnership with women. And then I know that today, there are probably as many, if not more, practitioners of the spiritual exercises in women. So I think there's an opportunity for us to look at the leadership of women with this fundamental spirituality that we have, and to listen to what they're telling us about this spirituality. But the other thing is Ignatius invites us to pay attention deeply to our interiority that does not need to be interpreted by the patriarchal church or any church or any authority. So it's I think the Ignatian principle of trusting the inherent authority that we have and God's desire to work directly with us. It takes the hierarchical church and the male-dominated church out of the equation in one sense and invites people to speak directly with, and then can turn around and contribute to the life of the church in the ways that women have been throughout its history. So those are just a couple thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead. I often teach courses online, and what I've decided to do, especially in light of the loneliness that so many students experience, is that at the end of every module, I have what I call self-care tips, and a lot of them are just really easy sacramental moments that a person could experience in their ordinary life. So for example, you're waiting to pay your bill somewhere. Just take a breath and really experience what it is to be there. Or if you're waiting, a lot of my students are parents, well, you're waiting for your child to get dressed. Really reflect for a moment on the gift of that child. So as Ed Peck was explaining, just these Ignatian moments of recognizing God's presence in everyday life. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you for your talk. I think you've heard me ask this question kind of sort of already once or twice. I wonder if you could say a little more about what difference a Catholic case for women's leadership makes for our conception of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So, lots of cases for women's leadership, right? Does this particular case give us a different vision of women's leadership in a way that might really be worth underlining?
Sure. Well, I'm certainly open to other ideas about this. I'm not sure that the Catholic case gets us a leader who necessarily looks different from a leader who's formed in another tradition. But what I would say is similar to what we said in our book about how Catholic social thought can inform decision-making at Catholic colleges and universities, is that the Catholic tradition gives us vision, it gives us language, it gives us ways of explaining this to one another, it gives us a vision for what could be, particularly I think as we think about the kingdom of God as a vision of God's love fully saturating this world. But I'm not sure, just as with any ethical perspective, I don't know if we look at a Catholic perspective or a Catholic person and a person of another faith, I don't think it's going to necessarily look different. Yes?
Kind of on this point, one day I was going down a rabbit hole of all of the Catholic colleges in the United States, and I was looking at them, I was looking at Jesuit ones, and then I was looking at ones that are maybe run by other orders, such as by women. And I just started to wonder about the culture of the institutions and how the daily practices of the culture of different Catholic institutions, especially those that were founded by women religious orders, like, are there any practices that you think you could learn from? Like, what do you do on a daily basis to develop women and develop women leaders that maybe we haven't done here?
Yeah, so I teach at a college that was founded by the Sisters of Mercy. And one of the key aspects of their charism is hospitality. And so part of the leadership of that college involves inviting people who typically have been excluded from education, from higher education, into our community, particularly undocumented students We have a residence hall on campus for women who are parenting young children. And so the leaders of our school have had to be really creative in gathering the resources needed for those kinds of programs that are not money makers. In fact, they're really expensive. But the presence of those students, we can say, not only is being at College of St. Mary good for them, I hope, but it's also instructive for everyone else. So I would say this sense of inclusion for us, mercy and hospitality are really important parts of our charism. Thank you. Yes, Jane, here.
I noticed how the number of women in leadership positions when it gets to the executive level, there's a drop off. I was just wondering how we as a society can raise that number and reduce the just internalized mindset of our past.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've really thought about this. So I'd like to know, do you have some preliminary ideas about how we can improve this?
I believe that when women are in empowering environments, I go to an all-girls school, and that's definitely an empowering environment. But I believe that widening the discussion among women and men as well will increase the kind of thought of women, which is a realistic idea of women in leadership roles, which is something that needs to be talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And then also to look at the social structures, the policies, procedures, the laws that either make it easier or more difficult for both men and women to parent while working. For example, I'm from a very conservative state, Nebraska, but we just recently passed in this election paid sick leave for parents who are working, both part-time and full-time. That is really an important piece of legislation for allowing women in particular to advance to higher levels, right? Because we know that women in heterosexual relationships often bear the brunt of taking a disproportionate share of housework and the emotional labor of the family. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of the internalized viewpoints we have about men's and women's roles. And then we also can look at the social structures that either help or make more difficult women's full inclusion and men's ability to care for families if they wish to, right? So there's an advantage to men in this as well.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, so much. Your talk was very inspiring. It gives us a lot to think about. And I just want to thank all of you for coming today, because earlier in Jennifer's talk, she mentioned the gap between the beautiful ideal that we have in this Catholic worldview. And I think it has something to do with the list of ingredients that we put together in our worldview, in the principles that you identified. But the gap between that vision and our current reality is going to be bridged by this generation of people and those who accompany them in and out of the classroom. So I want to thank you all for being here. I hope that you're able to take this to heart and to strive to make a difference. Those of you in business ethics, those of you who are entering any profession, and you're going to have a chance to make a difference and to bring these principles into bring them to life in new ways. And so you are the hope for our future. So thank you all for being here, and please give a round of applause to Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed being here with you. Thanks so much.